Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Darug people as the traditional custodians of the land upon which we stand. We recognise their connection to this country, we pay our respects to their elders both past and present, and we recognise that in pursuit of true reconciliation, words like these represent a start, not a finish. Thank you all for coming. This afternoon's memorial is for a man who played many different roles in many different lives. To some of us, Bernie Shepherd was a colleague. To others, he was a teacher. To some, he was a wise counsellor in their own endeavours, and to others, he was a deeply practical man who took the phrase "do it yourself" to remarkable new extremes. He was a friend that you had for life, or he was one that you might have forgotten that you had until you realised you really needed one. He was, of course, a family man. To the nephews and nieces, cousins and siblings, to the 10 grandchildren he lived to meet, to the 3 children that he raised on a diet of science, art and a healthy dose of the manual arts, and of course to Meg, his wife of 50 years and all the ones that the Registry of Births, Deaths and Marriages don't know about. I am number 2 son, in chronological terms only, David, and I am here just to provide a brief introduction and introduce our first speaker, and my siblings you'll get to meet through the course of the day. If you wanted to know anything about Dad, there were always better people to ask than Dad himself. It wasn't the product of arrogance or aloofness, it's just that he always seemed to be his least favourite subject. He loved talking about issues, breaking them down and looking for new ways to make them better. But what was done to make them better was inevitably the product of the people that he mobilised to get the job done, not anything he himself might have done. If pressed, Dad could give you the shape of things, but not so much of the colour. He didn't believe that every photo that would be improved by sticking your ugly mug in it. He was never one to burnish his own legend. However, as evidenced by the many fine and touching tributes that have emerged since his passing and before, plus the impressive accumulation of titles and life memberships and awards that he gathered in recent years, there were many who recognised his achievements and were more than willing to testify on his behalf. Our first speaker, Gary Richards, represents the longest association of anyone speaking today. He was a lifelong friend from Dad's school days right up to his final days. The Richards and the Shepherds clans were so intertwined that their status as family was one that only the Registry of Births, Deaths and Marriages cared about. We featured prominently in so many key moments of each other's lives that I would hesitate to list them for fear of missing something vital. For that, I turn to Gary.
Raise that a bit. Thank you, David. A remarkable person has left us. As you can see from the awards listed in the program, and as David just mentioned, Bernie was highly respected by a wide variety of stakeholders in secondary education and continued to contribute significantly until the end of his life. And of course, Bernie was also a loving husband, father, father-in-law and grandfather to his family, as well as being considered an uncle by my children. He was also my very close friend, close enough for me to think of him as a brother. My first recollection of Bernie is from our senior years at Christian Brothers High School at Lewisham in 1959 and 1960. Bernie was a newcomer to the school and was obliged to sit in the front row right in the centre. That was unusual, suggesting that he was already a known quantity, needing tight supervision. That location didn't seem to worry Bernie. In fact, it was his preferred position throughout his life, one that he came to refer to as downstage centre. Bernie was outspoken, always ready with a thoughtful and often witty opinion in class, and with a too clever by half manner that made him popular with us spotty-faced teenagers, but generally annoyed the brothers. He was also good at all sports and excelled at athletics, where he was the school champion. Bernie's reputation from his previous school had preceded him, and he associated with the more rebellious among us, while I hung around with the more nerdy group. Rumours abounded of Bernie and his friends getting up to mischief away from the school. To my surprise, we became close and lifelong friends almost instantly when we were both enrolling at Sydney University on Teachers College scholarships, to become science teachers. Bernie suddenly appeared at my side from the crowd, an action often repeated throughout our lives. For some reason, he could always find me in a crowd before I spotted him. By the end of that day, we were best friends and have remained so ever since. Bernie had put his rebellious childhood behind him, but still had that irritating, too clever by half manner of speaking. After he had met my parents for the first time, my father warned me off him, considering him as being not of good character. But I saw Bernie as being more of a rough diamond and ignored Dad's advice. Well, by the time Bernie and Meg married 5 years later, Bernie had become a much-loved friend of the family. 1961 was our first year at Sydney University, and for Bernie his last. He failed all his subjects and was transferred to the Teachers' College for a 2-year course. I barely scraped through and spent the next 2 years trying to pass all my second-year subjects before transferring to the college for a 1-year course. We both emerged as 2-year trained teachers, which was the norm in those days, but by then you also needed a 3-year qualification in order to be promoted, so we had more study ahead of us. While we were muddling through our courses, we learnt other things that stayed with us and helped us to grow up. In our first year, we joined the Film Society, learning to show cinema movies, drink beer and chase girls. When the new Union Theatre opened on campus, we volunteered as projectionists. The theatre also held live performances, supported by the latest stage lighting and sound equipment. Bernie and I were enraptured, doing so well that we were headhunted and offered paid work as stage electricians by the Elizabethan Theatre Trust, the predecessor of the Australian Ballet and Opera Australia. We worked with the Trust over the next 3 years. Bernie and I came away from that period with more than the skills we'd acquired in stagecraft and lighting design. The dedication, teamwork and professionalism of everyone involved, from the lowliest stagehand to visiting international opera and ballet stars, informed our approach to our future careers. And both of us seriously considered making our careers in professional theatre instead of teaching. But in the end, teaching won. Thank heavens. Bernie's first teaching appointment in 1964 was to Liverpool Boys High, considered at the time to be a very tough school. He was there for 8 years. During his first year, Bernie met a young lady, a fellow science teacher from another school. That was Meg, and they soon became a couple. Meg introduced Bernie to the Genesian Theatre, an amateur theatre in Kent Street in the city, formed by the Catholic Youth Organisation and still in operation today. Meg was appearing in a play, and on Bernie's first visit, the lighting system failed completely. Bernie was able to repair it quickly and later to rebuild it after joining the theatre. He then used his theatrical knowledge and skills to bring a very high standard to the technical aspects of their productions. In 1966, I returned for the Easter holidays from Albury, where I was teaching. By then, Bernie and Meg were engaged, and they invited me to make up a foursome for a night out, the other member being Meg's flatmate, June. By the time Meg and Bernie married in September of that year, June and I were a couple, and we married in September of the following year. Those of you who were colleagues of Bernie's may remember June Richards. She was the principal of Mount Druitt High School throughout the 90s and an executive member of the New South Wales Secondary Principals Council until her death in 2007. Meg and June were more than flatmates, having met and become friends at Teachers' College in Newcastle through the Drama Club. The four of us were now bound by 2 marriages and 2 close friendships, with an interest in live theatre, in addition to also all being teachers, all 2-year trained and ready for more study. Meg, June and I enrolled at the new Macquarie University, eventually acquiring degrees in various fields other than our teaching subjects, while Bernie took a different path. His science master, Jim Rowe, was an excellent teacher and leader with a staff of young men in their first years of teaching and all 2-year trained. He persuaded them to enrol in a diploma of applied science at the Technical College at Ultimo and enrolled himself as well. They were able to support each other and came away with lots of practical skills in science that Bernie put to good use. Jim was very much a father figure to Bernie and the others, and they maintained contact with him throughout his life. He attended Bernie's 60th birthday celebrations, and a few years ago, Bernie and others from that group attended Jim's funeral. In 1970, Bernie and Meg moved into their first house. They had bought a block of land backing onto a tree-filled reserve in a new subdivision in a remote suburb. Or so it seemed to June and me. It was actually Balkan Hills, and was a clever move. Bernie and Meg designed that interesting house themselves, and it served them well for almost 40 years. As well as house building, Bernie and Meg started their family in 1970, with June and I starting ours 2 years later. The children were born in alternating order, as if forming one family. And because of our frequent contact, those 5 children, Tim, Helen, David, Sarah and Emma, grew up together, considering each other as cousins. They are all in their 40s now, of course, and with their own partners and families. It's been comforting to see how well they all support each other and their parents through the various celebrations, crises and grieving that are part of life. They are doing that today. In 1971, I was returning to teaching after 2 years of full-time study when a vacancy occurred in the science department at Liverpool Boys High. I immediately took it, despite being advised that it was a difficult school and there were more desirable ones closer to home. But Bernie was still there, so there was no way I was going anywhere else. Jim had moved away from the area unexpectedly, and Bernie was now acting science master. He proved to be an inspired teacher and leader for the rest of that year, a joy to work with, but the promotion system meant that in 1972 someone else took that position and Bernie was promoted to science master at Des Moines Boys High. In 1974, Bernie left Des Moines after accepting a position as a curriculum consultant. This involved developing science syllabuses and travelling around the state delivering professional development to groups of science teachers, during which time his talents became recognised more widely. In that period, the ABC produced a series of science TV programs that could be used as resources by classroom teachers. Their content and presentation were handled by Bernie and his colleague Diane Parks. Those programs are widely praised for their quality and innovative approach. In 1978, Bernie was appointed head teacher of the science department at Colo High School at North Richmond. Being new, Colo offered plentiful opportunities for innovation in teaching, which he approached with relish. This was a time when desktop computers had finally become available and affordable, something that I'd been waiting for since my days of mainframe computing at Macquarie. I was busy experimenting with new teaching and administrative uses of computers at my school when Bernie approached me with a problem he was having timetabling his faculty with pencil and paper. I introduced him to spreadsheets, a new concept then, and he was amazed. Bernie's commitment to spreadsheets, Bernie's commitment to spreadsheets has long been a source of amusement in the Shepherd household. So now, guys, you know it's all down to me. Bernie quickly acquired a computer, but soon ran into the limitations of spreadsheets. I then had to persuade him that he would be a natural at developing software for computers. He took up the challenge and, with the help of a programming course and some tutoring from me, soon became an excellent programmer and a creative software designer. Bernie could turn his hand to just about anything, and when we were younger, it was usually him teaching me skills. He built the kitchen for their first house himself. Whenever our cars broke down, he knew how to fix them. He designed and installed a large swimming pool himself. When he and Meg could afford to build the bottom story of their house, he did the design and most of the building himself. I often found myself being Bernie's labourer on these projects, at least until Tim and Dave were old enough to be dragooned into service. In 1987, Bernie was appointed deputy at Seven Hills High, where he was highly valued, but he wasn't there for long. In 1989, Bernie won the position of founding principal at this school, the newly created St Mary's Senior High School. The appointment was on merit, and Bernie became a principal sooner than he otherwise would have. His vision of what a senior school should be was accepted from the start, leaving him free to implement it on his own terms. Bernie's leadership here is legendary and is one of the factors that led to his being awarded membership of the Order of Australia. Now that he was a principal, Bernie could be a member of the New South Wales Secondary Principals Council. He soon rose to prominence, and when the state government established the Board of Studies in 1990, Bernie's was one of the names put forward as their representative. His was chosen, and he went on to be a foundation member of the board for 8 years. Afterwards, he continued as a valued advisor, producing papers and working in various positions connected to the HSC examinations each year for the rest of his life, even last year when he was ill. So Bernie's contribution to secondary education was continuous for over 50 years. Bernie's appointment to the board provided further opportunities for us to interact professionally. I had left classroom teaching some years earlier and was working at the board's office as a researcher and software developer. I was able to help Bernie understand the technical aspects of the papers coming before the board, and he was able to provide me with wider insights into the board's work. With my help, Bernie developed expertise in understanding the statistical aspects of educational assessment and of the HSC scaling process. He served as chair of the HSC Scaling Committee on occasion and smoothed the way for some of my software to be introduced to make the scaling process more transparent. Although Bernie had retired at the end of 2004, he remained active in the educational community, as we know. In more recent years, when the Commonwealth Government introduced the My Schools website, Bernie used his skills to perform sophisticated and revealing analyses that continue to inform the ongoing debate about school funding. Last year, when he showed me the latest analysis that he and Chris Bonner were about to publish, I complimented him on his cleverness. He replied modestly that I had taught him how to do such things. But that had been 20 years ago, and I've not been involved since my retirement many years ago. Bernie deserves full credit for these contributions and the subtle sophistication of his analyses. There is no doubt of the admiration and affection that Bernie felt for Chris, who was overseas when Bernie went into palliative care. Bernie asked after him and the date of his return daily. They met for the last time a week or so before Bernie's death, while Bernie was still able to communicate. Their mutual respect and affection was evident. In 2007, when June was dying, and afterwards when I was grieving, Bernie and Meg were there with help and support. In 2010, when Nikki and I married, they were there again to welcome and encourage, even joining us in the United States for our second wedding reception, pardon me, this time for Nikki's American relatives and friends. Meg has been a tower of strength and a calming influence on everyone as Bernie's death approached and with all that's been required since then. She slept at Bernie's bedside every night during his last weeks, organised the most beautiful family funeral held at their home, and has been the major organiser for today's memorial gathering. In a few weeks' time, she will accept Bernie's final award on his behalf. I had the privilege of seeing Bernie grow from a rebellious teenager to a man of great integrity, who used his many talents to serve the community, and always with humility. We can only be judged by the manner in which we've led our lives, and by any measure, Bernie has done well. Bernie's been my very close friend for more than half a century. We had a remarkable understanding of and affinity for each other, and I shall miss him very much.
Standing up here and looking out is quite overwhelming. My name's Emma, I'm child number 3, and I was Dad's favourite daughter. I'm not a public speaker like my dad, so I'm going to try and not lose my place in my notes. My dad, I know, would be feeling very humbled by the people that are here today to acknowledge, honour and celebrate his life. He would still, however, be trying to shift the focus and acknowledge all those around him that supported and helped him to get to where he was. That's who my dad was. He never did anything for the acknowledgement, the praise, the recognition. He purely did it because whatever it was, it just needed to be done. In the last months of Dad's life, he received many pretty awesome acknowledgements. Many were the type of acknowledgements that are normally not delivered until something like today's celebration. But Dad was given the blessing of time, and it was such a lovely thing to be able to read and tell him about many of them prior to his passing. But Dad being Dad, still, none of the words sat well with him. He was constantly saying what lovely words they were, but they weren't really about him. Or, it wasn't just me who did that, there were always others. Some of the comments that stood out the most were thanking and praising him for being such a kind and thoughtful leader, for giving them second chances, for treating everyone as an equal, for treating them with respect, for showing compassion, for being a warm and wonderful man. As a dad to the three of us, that's what he was, and so much more. Dad's love and support was constant and unconditional. Never mattered what the problem was. He was always there to listen and help calmly and methodically to work through a solution, even if all you really wanted to do was scream. I think that is what I will miss the most. He had an answer to pretty much everything. In fact, the first time I ever consciously remember hearing him admit that he'd been stumped by something was probably only about 6 months ago, while helping Noah with some of his 3-unit maths homework. He was floored that Noah could understand it better than him, and even giggled at the fact that he actually didn't get something and his 17-year-old grandson could explain it better than he could. Teaching was Dad's passion. Helping and making a difference was his life work. And someone that knows a lot about this part of his life is our following speaker. Dr. Mavona Collins worked with my dad for many years, and I know that Dad held a high regard, not only for her opinion and advice, but also for the friendship they created over many years. Their work lives intertwined at many levels throughout both of their careers, and I know that the respect that Dad held for her was very special, and I would like to invite her up here to tell you more.
Very much, Emma. Find the places. Everyone sitting here in front of us today has their own relationship with Bernie and has their own version of Bernie. And I'm sure before the afternoon's out, a lot of people will have shared a lot of humorous stories and loving stories of their time knowing Bernie. I've been asked to talk about one special part of Bernie's life, and that was his time as a foundation principal of this school and setting it up. I had known Bernie before I became involved with the school, and that was very, very typical Bernie. We first crossed paths sometime in the late 1980s, I think it was, and it had to do with the Australian College of Education, now known as the Australian College of Educators, I believe. I was the president of the regional group, Western Sydney Regional Group. I think that was my title. And we had decided that we would start honouring some outstanding teachers in Western Sydney for all sorts of reasons, but mainly to acknowledge the wonderful work so many teachers were doing. So we called for nominations. Primary school teachers, of course, are much better at responding to these calls and at recognising their colleagues. And so we had a number of worthy nominations. Then an extraordinary nomination came in for one, Bernie Shepherd, the newish principal of the recently established St Mary's High. The superlatives left me questioning if anyone could especially a principal, could be worthy of such high praise. So I began to investigate. The staff I contacted seemed all to agree with the nomination. So at the school, in the school lecture theatre, a few weeks later, Bernie, along with several other teachers, was duly awarded an Outstanding Educator certificate. I had been in contact with him prior to this, and no one who knew Bernie would be in any doubt that his first response was, "Okay, but surely it should be awarded to the whole staff of St Mary's. I'm only the principal." Later, when I was involved in another clandestine operation involving a nomination for his Australia's Honours Award, I had a similar conversation one night when he phoned me about having received a letter. And I think you know about the letter. And I said, "Well, Bernie, I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, I think you do know about this letter." And I said, "Well, if it's the letter I think it is, you shouldn't be talking about it. It's not public yet." And so we had a conversation, during which he accused me of, again, singling out an individual instead of acknowledging the whole team at St Mary's. His words, again, "I was just one of a team." My response to this haranguing was, "Just take it for public education, Bernie. You're the first public education school principal to be awarded such a, whatever the letter said." And we didn't mention what it said. And he kind of half accepted that. But I know that members of the staff here know that he, when he acknowledged that he had received it, he just said, "It is for everyone at St Mary's. I'm just the boss." He was a remarkable educator, pioneer in many fields, as Gary has pointed out, whether it was in his video presentations, his work as a curriculum consultant, or principal of the first New South Wales State Senior High School. I was talking to a cousin of mine recently who was a curriculum consultant for primary social studies, I think, at the same time Bernie was there. And I said, "Oh, were you there when Bernie was there?" And she said, "Oh, Bernie Shepherd." And I said, "Right, so you knew him, did you?" "Oh, yes, I knew Bernie. Mostly the primary consultants and the secondary consultants didn't mix very much, but everyone knew Bernie." And I thought, yes, everyone knew Bernie. He was a man of vision, a vision developed in part from his own experiences of, in his own words, being a lost school graduate thrust into an adult world of having to make his own decisions about his future and being left to take responsibility for his own learning and indeed his life. And this was after having recently left the school system where the modus operandi was sit down, sit still, shut up and listen, with 6 of the best regularly administered to encourage conformity. I think a lot of us remember such days. Over his professional life, he had developed a number of ideas of how young senior students should be best prepared for this transition into either further education or the workforce, in better shape than he and so many of us had been. As a result, when he was appointed to lead the newly formed experimental senior high school, he came with many ideas and proposals on what was needed to make this experiment work and fulfil part of its purpose, to raise the educational standards in Western Sydney. This vision of his, that the school would become a community where the students would be treated as young adults, take responsibility for their own learning, but in a very supportive and caring environment, led by a professional staff, required much planning, professional development of the staff, and his own ability to enthuse all concerned with the possibilities that the school could now offer. He was, of course, ably supported in the earlier years, when I had something to do with the school, with two pretty outstanding people, Barry Lovegrove and Chris Causey. And we'll talk a bit more about B1 and B2 later. And a whole bunch of department heads of ability, professionalism and enthusiasm. Early on, he established the school council, comprising representatives of the staff, the students, community representatives, and a body which was to provide him with a sounding board, sane advice and support in establishing a successful senior high. It was in this capacity that I became intimately involved with the school and its principal, staff and students. At this time, Bernie, as if he didn't have enough on his plate, and we won't talk about Board of Studies, examiners committees, P&Cs, secondary principals, etc., 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 he was invited at my instigation to join an advisory committee at the newly established University of Western Sydney. Professor Jill Mailing, head of the then UWS Nepean, called me and asked if I could nominate an outstanding educator in Western Sydney who had his finger on the pulse of both the region and HSC graduates and their needs. No need to think, get Bernie. I think he was not too pleased with me, but of course he agreed, and provided excellent input into the shape of this new university. He got his own back soon after, however, when he asked me if I would join the school council as a community member. And so began a dozen or so years of interaction between school and university, the memories of which I treasure as one of the better educational experiences of my career. Developing a new school is one thing. Keeping good faith with the neighbouring schools who feared that this new school was taking some of its best and brightest at the end of Year 10 was another. Bernie kept a low profile and developed an approach to selecting students which proved very successful. Yes, it was selective, but the selection was based on demonstrated ability of an applicant to work independently in an adult learning environment. Academically, it was comprehensive, but students who found the level of self-direction at the school too challenging quickly returned to their old schools, and that number was always very small. And they left in the first weeks of the school year with little interruption to their education. It had to be selective, for throughout my time of involvement, there were often over 2,000 applicants for the 400 odd places available for students joining the school each year. By the time I finished my time at the school, St Mary's had been accepted as an integral part of educational provision in the region, with new technologies being introduced to share staff expertise across and between neighbouring schools to maximise the learning experiences of a much wider group. St Mary's was at the forefront of these developments and benefited as much from the other teachers as they offered. The challenge of taking in such a number each year and only having the students for 2 years created the need to quickly settle the students into the school, and it was remarkable how quickly the student body adopted the St Mary's ethos and formed a true school community. The structures were put in place, the cluster groups in particular, where small groups of students working with teachers were able to develop a sense of belonging to a much bigger school. And all the teachers, certainly all the ones I met, and I met most of them, all the teachers played a huge part in carrying out Bernie's idea of getting the students involved and involved in their learning. Improving student outcomes was a critical part of the school's purpose. It will come as no surprise to you that at the beginning of the school year, Bernie would arrive to school council meeting armed with a sheet of graphs, statistics, breakdowns, armed with his computer in tow and a screen to hand, and we would meticulously go through every possible aspect of every subject and every result. I pity the poor staff present who had already been through it at least once or twice the same week. But always the graph that most excited Bernie was the one showing the value-added rating of every student based on their Year 10 school certificate results. It was rare to find even one of the students who had slipped backwards, and the improvement in the vast majority was often spectacular. It was worth going through the endless graphs to witness the pride the school had in their students. And as always, Bernie simply added, he'd just done the statistics and the graphs. It was his staff and the students who were responsible for the great success. The students at St Mary's reminded me of a younger version of the university students I was used to, not heavily regimented, but respectful and involved. One memorable example of Bernie's approach to dealing with his school and its students started with an evening phone call to me. Professor Tony Vinson, who was conducting research into what makes a good school, was to be visiting the next day, and could I be there at 9 o'clock, please, to meet him? The next morning I greeted the professor, whose work with jail inmates I was very familiar with, but I found that Bernie was at the Board of Studies. Of course, Barry was there, and the school was humming along as usual. The first thing the good professor wanted was to meet half a dozen students, so I asked Barry to find some. Surprise number one for Professor Vincent. No one had been primed for this, and so the first half dozen who were sitting out working under the trees were called in. But then he got the second surprise. The students answered all questions with enthusiasm and understanding, except for one. Could they tell him about the school rules? Blank faces all round. And what was this uniform, since they were all dressed differently? Oh, that was easily answered. But the school rules? I suggested there was a statement somewhere, so exited to find it. Blank looks in the office. Blank looks from the teachers I saw. Then one remembered something and produced a page with a short paragraph on it, about 5 lines. I can't remember the exact wording, but it was something like this. Students at St Mary's shall treat everyone at the school as they wish to be treated themselves. The school, which operated so happily and successfully, had no school rules, just expectations. A touch of Bernie here, who always believed that if you treat people well, they will respond in kind. And in this case, he was so right. On another occasion, I received another phone call at night. Bernie wanted to run past me something that had occurred at the school that day. A father and his son had made an appointment to see if the school would take the lad on for his HSC. He was about a term and a half away from the HSC exams and had been expelled from a very prestigious private school. His crime had been that he had left the school premises during the lunch hour to join a protest in the city against Australia's involvement in the Iraq War. He said he had removed his tie and blazer so the school would not be identified, but it was clearly a step too far and he was expelled. He had searched far and wide for a school which offered his subjects and would take him in. And finally, he found St Mary's Senior. Bernie had been impressed by the young man, but wanted to be sure the school council would be happy with his decision. So he called me. For me, it was a no-brainer. Firstly, I knew Bernie had already made the decision. Being about as big a rebel as he was, I could see the value in offering a lifeline to a young kid who had a social conscience. I'm not sure. No, I better not say any more than that. And so I just said, fine, Bernie, the school council will not object at all. There will be no story about it. In fact, most of the school council and probably most of the staff won't even know it's happened. It's just another new boy arriving for the school. The lad was duly enrolled. I'm not sure what he made of the fact that he was expected to be present at every one of his lessons, but apart from that, He could use his time however he wished, as was the custom for everyone. I think that young man will remember Bernie to this day for allowing him to complete his studies and enter university. Bernie knew a lot about justice and giving another person another chance. There's so many similar stories of Bernie taking the decision to accept students who needed a home and finding one at the school. I became aware that the staff went more than the extra mile to assist students who were having serious personal or family issues, always with the full support of Bernie, who firmly believed good education began with caring for the welfare of the students so that they could focus on creating their own futures through education. Some of the initiatives came to the school council. Some of these would probably have raised the eyebrows of people higher up in the department, but they worked. The students benefited, and all was well. Perhaps the most significant initiative to support students was in the establishment of the study room, where students who lacked resources at home or a quiet space could get on with their work with teachers to hand if they needed some extra tutoring. And I know that many, many students over the years have benefited from having a quiet space to do their work. Bernie understood that he had a vision. He understood that he could make it work. He also understood that to create the full heart of the school, he needed others to implement and take forward what his conceptions were. He was lucky. He had B2. He had Chris. He had wonderful teachers. And it was through, and Bernie was quite right, it was through this big combination of ideas, the exchange of ideas, and the heart that the teachers put into their work that made the school what it became. Bernie was not all seriousness. One of the most endearing memories is, of course, B1 and B2, in full costume, performing at school events, Bernie and Barry. All the students refer to them as B1 and B2. Why not? They got up on stage, dancing around in pyjamas with incredible banana heads almost in place, and it was a sight to behold. And Barry will share the story with you later if you ask him of how he got his hand stuck to the head at one stage because it started to come apart during the performance. Many of us will remember the costumes making an appearance at Bernie's retirement function, then never to be again seen in public. Oh yeah? Bernie was a great colleague. He achieved much. But more than that, he was a great friend. He was a warm, caring, talented, innovative, frustrating human being who just happened to be thrilled by analysing statistics. As I said, he wasn't perfect. He was loved by his staff and held in great affection by all who worked with him on the school council. He was held in great respect by all the students he came in touch with. He left big shoes to fill when he finally retired, and an even bigger hole in so many of our lives now he is no longer with us. To Meg and their children and grandchildren, I offer my sincere condolences, and I know I speak for many when I say we will never see his like again. Farewell, dear friend. It was a great ride working with you, and even better, sharing your friendship for the last 35 years. Thank you.
We had invited a former student of St Mary's, Taraj Vaziri, to sing one of Dad's favourite tunes, but he had to be called away to Melbourne earlier on in the week and couldn't make things work. So he sends his apologies, and we shall move on. Good afternoon. My name's Tim Shepherd. I'm Bernie's son number one, in chronological order only. I'm not the favourite daughter. The dreaded HSC, that life-changing pressure cooker event that occurs at the end of every student's school life. Months of study, assessments, tests, more study, panic attacks, study, missed meals, study, hours without sunlight, study. Culminating in 2 weeks of exams, 200 soon-to-be bona fide adults locked in a large, dusty, cold school hall, writing away feverishly while the teachers look on, remote and vigilant for any sign of cheating. All over the suburb, students waking in cold sweats during the early hours, realising that they'd messed up Newton's second law, or they'd completely forgotten to revise their carbon chemistry notes. At least that's what I remember. And then I learned that Dad was in on it all. He was part of the gang that was inflicting this terror on all the kids in New South Wales. Okay, I exaggerate. My HSC experience was from about 20 plus years ago, and so it's probably changed quite a bit. To be honest, I don't know an awful lot about Dad's work with HSC and the Board of Studies, apart from the fact that he put a lot of blood and sweat into trying to make it the best indicator of a student's potential as he could possibly make it. Every year there would be some tweak to the marking or scaling formulas, and then he would need to reanalyse and then recommend more tweaks for the following year. Dad continued working with the HSC right up until the 2016 HSC year, last year, collecting and analysing thousands of stats for the armies of exam markers that would meet in a large, dusty, cold shed at a racecourse to mark exam papers while supervisors looked on, remote and vigilant. The next speaker is one of Dad's many colleagues during this time, and he is much better placed to illuminate the effect that Dad's work had than I can. Professor Tom Aligonaris, I hope I've got that right, is chair of the New South Wales Education Standards Authority, NESA, which replaced the Board of Studies, Teaching and Educational Standards New South Wales, BOSTES, which in turn replaced the Board of Studies. In addition to being the chair of NESA, Tom was the president of the two formal boards. He is also an adjunct professor in the Sydney School of Education and Social Work at the University of Sydney. I'd like to invite Tom up to speak.
Firstly, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to say a couple of words of tribute. Very grateful to Chris and the family for the opportunity on behalf of myself and everyone at the board. As you've just heard, Bernie was a key part of our work at the board, NESA. I'll refer to it as the board as it has been for most of our memories. He was, as you've heard, the first Secondary Principals Council representative on the inaugural Board of Studies. And I have to say to colleagues here, I see very many faces, that a climate, a relationship of trust and professionalism doesn't just come into being, it's built on foundations. And I've had a lot of time to think about this and try to find the right words. And we've all benefited, gained intellectually and emotionally, of course professionally, because we've worked on the foundations as that Bernie built on behalf of the board and the Secondary Principals Council, and I know we're all very grateful. Bernie was, of course, not just a member of the board, he was a member of a number of committees, curriculum assessment, and he was a long-standing trustee of the important Brother John Taylor Memorial Prize, a prize granted to students that have overcome significant difficulties to achieve outstanding results. I'll come back to that. In the aggregate of his contributions to the board, Bernie was amongst the most well-regarded individuals in the organisation's history. Bernie exemplified what all education aspires to. He was an expert. He was an expert in science education, in curriculum, in assessment, and he was a natural, understated, modest expert in dealing with people. Perhaps most significantly, he had a deep ethical commitment to transparency and to justice. For all his really outstanding and seminal contributions, I can't help but feel that the Brother John Taylor Memorial Prize most represented his nature and professional standing. It's in the nature of this work, in this prize, and in the nature of Bernie, to be compassionate, authoritative, and wise. The basis of this regard was Bernie's professionalism, but that professionalism combined with the humanity with which he exercised his responsibilities. At the board, Bernie's presence and professionalism was reassuring to everyone, including myself as president of the board. And as I say, I've spent a bit of time trying to find each word, so it's not just a bunch of words stuck together, I have to tell you. But in doing that, I had images come into your mind, and I know from looking around the faces here that you've all been in situations where you've walked along rooms in an organisation for which you're responsible, or many of you have, and you see a meeting going on. In my case, it might have been something like the physics exam specifications or the maths extension, something, and you think to yourself, gee, I hope that's going well. And you sort of want to be there yourself, but you can't. Well, for me, spotting Bernie in that room just reassured me, not only because his contribution was going to be important and well considered, but because I knew that all of our own people would be lifting themselves to their best because they were with a person that they regarded as one of their more important elders, if I could use that term. So exemplified what we want our profession to be. Bernie's care recognised the stakes that our work holds for individual young people and their aspirations. His quiet, undemonstrative way of doing the work signified correctly that he held reserves of knowledge and authority. His presence therefore gave me and all around him at the board confidence that this enormous collective obligation to help educate young people with care and expertise was indeed in hand. Bernie's expert contributions at the board were multiplied in their effect through markers, teachers and educational administrators right through the organisation. Everyone walked away from an encounter with Bernie consciously or unconsciously committed once again to the virtuous educational mission of quality and fairness. We can hope to replicate the sort of warm, genuine professionalism that Bernie brought to bear on education in New South Wales and nationally, but Bernie Shepherd's particular contribution will be unique. It is built into the annals of Australia's educational development, directly and through the board, and into the substance of educational professionalism directly and through the Secondary Principals Council in this country. We are all grateful.
Thank you, Tom. When Dad retired for the first time, an important distinction, I initially wondered how he'd pass his time without a school to run, take up caravanning, lawn bowls, knitting. In the course of a conversation, he dropped, "Well, there's some fascinating data buried on that My School's website. If only I could find a way to get my hands on it." Okay, you don't want to give fishing a shot first, or no? Okay, well, fair enough. Stay busy. This is not to say that he didn't seek other things to do once he hung up the red shirt and yellow tie combo, but my initial reaction was not, well, this is something I'll hear about. This was him keeping his hand in on his vocation, his life's work. I certainly wasn't expecting a great deal to come out of it beyond academic curiosity. Living outside of the Sydney bubble, as I do, I was the one that flew the nest the furthest. It wasn't really apparent to me beyond his work for content-hungry news sites that just what a sense of an animating sense of purpose this work gave him, nor the traction that it was gaining in the wider community. One of his early forays into the editorial space was a piece about the effect of selective schooling on educational outcomes for the broader population. It was everything to those familiar with his work would expect: dispassionate, meticulous, informed by decades of experience. To an audience with a direct stake in educational policy, it probably generated some interesting discussion about better ways to achieve fairer outcomes for all. To the Guardian comment section, however, this was not quite that forum. If you listened carefully, you could detect the sound of rushing air as a carefully argued point whistled past people's ears while they whinged about whatever tangentially related complaint was on their minds at the time, about how why should my schooling be held back by all of these morons, blah, 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 blah. There was one that actually used the word, that went for the author and put the words researcher in scare quotes, and never before have I wanted an app that could punch someone in the neck over the internet. As good as Dad was at breaking down and reassembling an issue into a new and improved whole, the art of taking that message to a wider world was not one that he necessarily relished. An anecdote that occurred to me this morning was when he retired from St Mary's. He did an interview with the local paper. It was a lovely front page spread, lovely photo, glowing article. And somewhere in the course of the conversation, he sort of flippantly said, when asked, "Well, what will you do when you retire?" he sort of flippantly threw out, "Oh, I'll haunt the place." You can imagine, some headlines write themselves. And if anyone still has that newspaper, it has taken on possibly a new and more interesting context. As good as our next speaker, Chris Bonner, proved the perfect ally in his cause. He was an equally esteemed blend of experience and qualification, and similarly possessed with a like-minded determination to right the creeping wrongs in the school funding system. As a partnership, their individual strengths and shared wisdom combined to do far more than just get an internet rabble on message. Before I hand over to Chris to describe a little bit more about what that entailed, I'll let Dad give you a little bit of insight on how the magic worked. The division of labour between Chris and I goes something like this. I do most of the number crunching, in brackets. Chris is a geography teacher after all, poor chap. I'm not sure what inflection to go with on that one, Chris. I assume it's not. He's from Barcelona. I'm sure it was well meant. Don't call the lawyers. Chris does most of the writing. Then I come in at the end, do the editing, and all of the "you can't say that stuff," and that is capitalised for emphasis. But it's the last line that stands out to me for its almost comical degree of understatement. Just for context, this came from an email that Dad sent a couple of months back following their latest Guardian missive, as years of analysis and lobbying and meetings and arguments were coming to a head in a national debate about Gonski 2.0. He simply wrote, "Seems to work well." Chris Bonner.
Thank you, David, I think. It probably sums it up, really, although Bernie's shot at geography teachers is a bit cruel. But Bernie had this amazing combination of skills. We've heard so much about that. He could certainly crunch the numbers, and his command of the English language is lethal. And he did exercise what I'd call a gentle veto, if needed, over what we would put our names to. But what do you say about a friend and colleague whose amazing life and work and commitment to others continued all the way up to his final time with us? Someone whose work all his life has been a gift that keeps on giving and still will. He must have had moments of despair over the last year or so. I was always amazed at the undemonstrative way that he would deal with what was, becoming pretty inevitable. He'd think it through and weigh up the evidence and the options. No place there for histrionics. He was a scientist, and doing things like that was a big part of his world, I guess. And yet, as we know, a scientist like few others. When he retired, I presented him with a T-shirt complete with the inscription, "I was edited by Bernie Shepherd." And the people whose work he had reviewed over the years were forced to wear it that night. And I think we'll see photographs coming up later. And of course he had to wear it as well because he would constantly review and go over his work and never be satisfied until it was absolutely correct. And some of the people there that night are here tonight because Bernie supported principals as a member of the Secretary Principals Council Executive and Deputy President also for a time. And he also held key roles in the Australian Principals peak group. So it's small wonder that principals around New South Wales and beyond held and hold Bernie's name in great reverence. He was an elder statesman long before he became elder. And these people lined up to pay their respects in the last few weeks. In the Jim Harkin, the previous SPC president, who's here today, he says Bernie lifted the overall profile and credibility of government secretary principals enormously with other sectors, the academic community, the union and subsequent governments. In Jim's words, he was one of our lions. And Judy King, it talks about how he radiated wisdom based on lots of experience and buckets of common sense. And Christine Causey talks about Bernie as a kind and loyal colleague and thoughtful, and his depth. And she says if Bernie only ever asked one question at a meeting, it was the most important one to be answered. And on the personal side, Lila Malarchik says his insight, support and love of family and friends was deep and genuine. And to Jim McAlpine, he was the epitome of calm and reason. And we've heard from Tom about Bernie's work with the board. Jim Harkin said that appointing Bernie to the Board of Studies was Terry Metherell's best decision. Be nice, Chris. Admittedly based on a certain benchmark of what constituted a good decision at the time. And of course Bernie went on from that to become such an indispensable part of the work of the board for over 2 decades. In retirement, whatever that was, he just kept giving. We both groaned when the My School website came out, but Bernie was quick to see the nuggets of gold, the information, the data which lay beneath the surface of what lies beneath. And what it really might tell us about not so much what Australia's schools were doing, yes, part of that, but what we were doing to Australia's schools. His analysis was unassailable. It had to be right, and it was right. It's never been challenged. And his findings resonated. Bernie, the work created a new conversation about schools. Travis McLeod, who's CEO of the Centre for Policy Development, and Travis and his team are here today, and Bernie was a fellow of the centre. He tells of his contribution even as his health deteriorated, because in the last frenetic 18 months, that work would be pretty hectic as deadlines had to be met. Travis says part of his unstinting commitment to improving the livelihoods of Australia's most disadvantaged students. And all this time, Bernie would never overstate what he did. I received more than one email in which he would attach some thoughts and say, calculations for a document, and he'd call it his 2 cents worth. In financial terms, a massive understatement, because his revelation could have impacted on how Australia spends billions of dollars, and probably still could in many ways. And as you know, he didn't seek the limelight, but it sought him out. He was made a member of the Order of Australia, a fellow of the Australian College of Educators, as well as the CPD, and he seemed to gather life memberships, including from the Secondary Principals Council, the New South Wales PNC, the Australian Education Union. Remarkable recognition from such diverse organisations in the education sector. And Meg will soon accept for Bernie the Dr. Paul Brock Memorial Medal from ACEL. And the tributes come from this diversity of people. Mark Scott, Department of Education Secretary, refers to Bernie as a pioneering principal, a thought leader in Australian education, respected and admired by teachers everywhere. And Dr. Ken Boston, Ken's here today, Ken says, Australia owes an enormous debt of gratitude to Bernie for his objective and dispassionate analysis of national school performance data. And he says something else, I like this quote. He says, Bernie always paid me what I regard as the ultimate compliment. Unemotionally, thoughtfully and constructively, he always told me what I needed to know rather than what I might like to hear. Angelo Gavaradis, who, and there's many people send their apologies, Angelo reckons he's in Brussels, but we're not sure about that. Angelo's the previous Australian Education Union head. He worked with Bernie in this patch for a long, long time, in many capacities. He was struck by Bernie's deep commitment and loyalty to public education, and how he provided years of powerful evidence in support of justice. It drove Bernie, Angelo says, until he could write no more. And McIntyre, New South Wales branch president of the Australian Council for Educational Leaders, refers to how he worked with a humility that was driven by a deep sense of moral purpose. I know that Meg especially values these words, the family does. It all shows that Bernie made a difference at all levels, from individual students up to the movers and shakers, or in Bernie's priorities, from individual students down to the movers and shakers. And he'd do this occasionally revealing again that in that understated way his wide range of talents and interests, whether it be photography, the magic of the theatre, computer programming, you name it. In my view, he was truly a Renaissance person in the digital age. It's interesting. As a scientist and researcher, I think he had little time for legends. But in his own quiet way, amongst students and teachers and parents and principals and many others, he became one. Let me finish with part of a conversation I had with Bernie in those final days. There's this African word, Bantu word, Ubuntu. In broad terms, it means, I am what I am through you. And by implication, of course, I am what I am because of you. It's a powerful concept, isn't it? I opened today by saying that Bernie was a gift that keeps on giving. And I look around this room and I see the people here. and in some measure, large or small, he's touched us all. We are what we are in some way through Bernie Shepherd, and that's his real gift to us.
Thank you, Chris. Dad's work brought him in touch with a lot of young adults. And as a teacher or a deputy head or a principal, he would have had to need to work out pretty quickly how to relate to each person, each young person in front of him, like all teachers need to do. The more I learned about how he carried his professional life and the comments from past students in various social media, Dad appeared to have had that knack of being able to relate to the individual young people in his classes or his schools. I think the next two speakers are examples of this knack that Dad had of being able to talk on separate levels. They can both also confidently boast that Dad was and probably still is their most enthusiastic and vocal supporter. Edith Shepherd has the dubious/exalted honour of being Dad's first grandchild. While she arrived a little earlier than what he probably expected, she soon showed him that being grandpa was a role that could suit him to a T. Over the following years, Dad was right there, through primary, secondary and tertiary schools, cheering away while Edith seemed to smash every educational hurdle that she came across. I think he also took a fair bit of pride in the fact that she would come to him first to report any newest academic achievement, or she would ask advice on something where she needed help. I didn't really do that in my school years, and I'm not sure how much advice my brother and sister also asked for in those years either. So I think Dad thought this grandpa role was pretty sweet. Speaking with Edith is Dad's fourth grandchild, Molly Gotzel. While Molly is a little lower on the grandchild ranks, where Edith wields success with words and a pen, Molly wields that same success with a bat and a ball. Dad was at many, many games, watching Molly conquering every sport she turned her mind to, praising and encouraging everything she did. And I know that for the games that he didn't get to, Molly would come up to Mum and Dad's place and they would talk about that day's game, or quite often games. Recently, Molly has taken up the hardest sporting job there is, refereeing club-level soccer games. If Dad had any concern about that, he didn't show it. He just respected her choice and gave his support like he always did. After Edith and Molly speak, there will be a video montage that will hopefully give a brief peek into Dad's life and the massive amount of ground that he covered during his time. Putting this together was no mean feat because while Dad was an avid, almost obsessive photographer and his image archives are vast, he isn't actually in 99% of those photos. So a lot of the pictures that you see are a collection of family photos and pictures from friends and colleagues over the years. And I thank everyone who has contributed into that. So I'd like to invite Edith and Molly.
Tall. All right. Hello, I'm Edith. I'm grandchild number 1, not just chronologically. So it's very strange trying to summarise all of your thoughts, your feelings when a huge chapter of your life has just come to a close. To reflect on a relationship that has been absolutely fundamental to shaping who you are is near impossible, but I'm going to give it a crack. And Chris Bonner, you stepped on my toes a little bit. You're a tough act to follow. Because, Grandpa, if there is a word to describe who you are and what you mean to me, it's not in any language that I can speak. Apparently it's one that Chris can. And it hasn't really been clearly in focus to me just what he was to me, and only really came quite sharply into view in the last year or so. So when I first began to really put my mind to it, I tried to think of, clear, distinct memories of moments in time that really stuck out, but there isn't any, and that is an incredible thing. Because what our relationship was too rich and too complex to be reduced down rather than any fixed point in time. It was a series of moments, of lessons and of morals, just like any other good story. And that is the legacy that he leaves with me and with all of us, I think. It won't be me fondly regaling anyone who will listen of stories of my late great-grandfather working away in his slightly terrifying study in Borkham Hills, leading the charge to fight to create a fairer and more equitable education system for every young person, retiring, or entering the final stages of his life with more grace and more dignity than I thought was possible. But there will certainly be plenty of that, and that's already been in full effect. But no, his legacy is so much more, and it cuts to the core of who I've grown up to become, I think, and where I want my life to lead. So for about a day and a half, when I found out just how sick he was about 18 months ago, I loosely flirted with the idea of going back and doing a Masters of Teaching. That was clearly temporary. I do not have the patience or the personality type for that kind of work. Huge respect to anyone who does, not me. But that temporary wave of insanity kind of kicked off this protracted period of reflection and self-discovery that kind of landed me where I am today, I think. And that story begins right here at St Mary's, strangely enough. All roads lead back to here, apparently. My parents, both teenagers, dropping the bomb that they're expecting a child. Hello. And it would have been so much easier for him to turn his back on all of us. Teen parenthood, it's hard, it's got some pretty dark statistics attached to it, but Grandpa was not going to let that happen. He had Mum in his classroom, he had me in a bouncer in his office, making sure that we all had every single opportunity that we needed to get where we could go in our lives. Because he was not willing to let circumstances jeopardise our opportunities in life. And there isn't a single day that goes by that I am not eternally grateful for that. But he didn't save my mum. What he gave her, and by proxy me, was the ability to save ourselves. His passion, his dedication, and the unwavering importance that he placed on fairness and education is something that has been forever instilled in the both of us, and that is truly a gift. So during that moment of madness last year, I decided that I wanted to follow in his footsteps. And although it's not in a classroom, or at least not in a traditional sense, I'd like to think that I am. He is the giant upon whose shoulders I stand. He is a true titan, as we have heard today, and I fully intend on carrying his legacy with me no matter where I go in life. And although I don't necessarily know exactly where that journey is taking me, he has given me a clarity, a drive, and a purpose that I never was able to identify before. So I don't know how to thank him enough. And although that book may have come to a close, a piece of him lives on in me and in every single person who he touched. And together we write the sequel to that story. It's an honour and it's a privilege to have him be my grandfather, and to have had the chance to learn and to benefit from a world that he had a hand in shaping. I love you eternally, Grandpa. Rest well.
pretty hard to come back off that. When you think of Bernie, what comes to your mind? Was he a principal, a teacher, a friend, a carer, a lover, or a dad? But to me, Bernie was my grandfather. And for the last 5 years, he lived exactly 44 steps from my front door. He was a true supporter and woke up most weekends and made the early journey down to the cold sporting fields. On the morning that my grandpa passed away, my football team wore black armbands, and together with the opposition, we observed a minute's silence before the game. Ironically, the opposition was St Mary's. And for Grandpa, we won the game. 3-0. Sorry, guys. But Grandpa didn't just cheer me from the sideline. I have struggled with my health since I started high school. But as teenagers do, I got bored very quickly with seeing doctors a few days every week. As Grandpa did, he sat me down and he told me that it was very important for me to understand what's going on inside myself. I replied with, "But that's so boring, Grandpa." He laughed and said, "I know, but it really is important." This was a perfect reflection on how he managed to live with his challenges throughout his life, but especially over this past year. He was always a great role model and someone who I will strive to be just like in my near future. Rest in peace, Grandpa. I love you.
That this balance is not of the same kind of quality as the electrical meters, and if we weighed this retort ring half a dozen times, we'd probably get half a dozen different readings.
but you, 'cause you have left your handprint on our hearts, but we know you would want us to move on, and I can't tell people the news 'cause I don't want it to be true, and the hugs, the sorries don't change the fact that you're not here. They say lives are measured by the lives that we change, and your legacy will live on long past the grave. Well, the people you've helped will now help those they can. A chain reaction all started by one man, and we will remember you, and your life will go on. There are souls in this world who are sent here to guide us and help us to choose which path we should take. And the more I look back, the more I regret, and the more things I think of that I should have said. But I know you'll be there watching me closely, making sure my life turns out right. And your life will go on. They say lives are measured by the lives that we change, and your legacy will live on long past the grave. Well, the people you've helped will now help those they can. A chain reaction all started by one man, and we will remember you, and your life will go on. Yes, your life will go on.
I just want to say that was an original composition by my son there. So, and I think it was awesome. I want to tell you about a conversation Dad and I had about 11 months ago, and then we had it again only about 5 weeks ago. His diagnosis had come through, and we were told initially he had 6 weeks with no treatment. We had no idea what the future was going to show us. And yet, after the initial wave of shock and grief had rolled over us all, we were sitting having dinner one night, and for some reason Dad and I were alone. And he leant over and he said, "I need to tell you something. I want you to know my life's been pretty damn good." "Yes, Dad, I understand." "No, I don't think you do. I really need you to understand. All of you. I'm really happy with where my life has gone. I've done some great things. I've raised 3 great kids and watched you all have some pretty amazing grandkids. My work life was fulfilling. I'm happy. Don't get me wrong, I wish I could have more time. I'd love to be able to see where all your kids end up, and have more time with Mum. But ultimately, I've been pretty lucky and I've had a good life. We both had tears by this stage, and I've only in my life ever seen my dad cry twice. Once at this point, and once when he had to accept the fact that he wasn't going to come back home with us. I truly believe that this is the reason Dad lasted way longer than anyone predicted. He accepted what was happening and he just rolled along with whatever was put in front of him. He never fought the process. The last 12 months, as hard as they've been, were a true blessing. Nothing was left unsaid, and things that were left unsaid, they weren't important. Dad was Dad right up until the end. He questioned his doctor as to what the plan was for his final stage, because Dad always needed a plan. He'd spent his whole life planning. When told he was going to have to leave it up to us to decide if he couldn't tell us, he just accepted that as the plan. His concern for everyone around him, including his nurses, was right there up until he couldn't communicate anymore. I really believe that this strength and acceptance was what made it easier to stand by and watch. He and Mum rolled along for the last 12 months together as they always had. They shared the ups and downs as they always had, discussing, negotiating, comparing and respecting the new journey that they were on. Don't get me wrong, there were still frustrations in there, but right up until the end, Mum and Dad's relationship stayed the same. It's this closeness that gets you through to 50 years married last September. A feat that is becoming less and less common and is truly a magnificent achievement. My mum was reading a letter yesterday from her bridesmaid, Pam Whelan. Mum and Dad had met at a party that she hosted and she had introduced them, and Pam said, "I still class it as one of my major achievements in life that I brought the two of you together." What an awesome team they were, and so I'd like to invite the woman who has all the dirt and all the stories, my mum, Meg.
To bring this down? I do. Okay. Well, you have heard a lot this afternoon about Bernie's teenage and adult and professional life. So I think it might be my role to look a little deeper into what I think formed his ability to achieve so much while still remaining a great human being. As it became more generally known that Bernie would not be with us for very much longer, he began to receive messages, as you've heard, from colleagues acknowledging his professional body of work. However, some messages began to arrive that also paid tribute to his personal qualities, and this amazed and puzzled him. Why would people attribute such wonderful personal characteristics to him? My reply was such that if such praise continued, he might end up canonised. And that conversation led us immediately, as conversations often did with us, to a well-known quotation, which I decided would give me the direction for my eulogy, and he agreed. In the immortal words of the mother of Brian, "He's not the Messiah, he's just a naughty boy." To explain his complicated upbringing, I will make use of Bernie's own words, which he wrote for his sister's eulogy. "I was born into the shepherd family of Gould Street, Campsie in Sydney on the 30th of May 1944, when the youngest member of that family was nearly 9 years old. And if you're guessing that little Bernie was something of a surprise, you'd be right. Our mother was a rather large lady, and my internal existence was completely misinterpreted until around 6 months. At the time I was born, my oldest half-sister was 24, and my 4 other siblings were 18, 15, 12, and almost 9. And this large and maturing family was suddenly thrown into disarray by the imminent arrival, at very short notice, of a completely unexpected new addition. Then early one morning, just 2 weeks after my arrival, our mother suffered a fatal heart attack. And some moments after she died, while everyone was dealing with the fact of what had happened, I woke up, demanding a feed. At that moment, it must have dawned on everyone how completely their world had changed. My eldest sister, Kitty, gave up her job to care for me, while Paddy, as second eldest, had to shoulder extra domestic responsibilities as well as hold down her job. However, by the time I was 4, Kitty had married, and later that year, our father married again. Far from bringing stability to the house, this new marriage was a source of tension, for which I was a special focus. Although I only have a 4-year-old's recollection of it, the atmosphere in the house was fraught, to say the least. Within a relatively few years, my older brother had moved out after a blazing row, and my remaining sisters had left home. So, here was young Bernie, the special responsibility of a 40-something-year-old spinster, inexperienced in dealing with young children, and one who was unaccepted by his older siblings. It placed him in a vulnerable position to be used as a weapon against the stepmother for a reason he didn't really understand. But unlike his older siblings, Bernie had no way to physically escape this fraught household. Or did he? As well as his bedroom and the backyard shed as suitable retreats over the years, he learned to close his mind and concentrate on whatever he himself chose. In this way, he learned to shut out all distractions and give his whole mind to a project of his choice. I suppose we would say now he created his desired world inside his head, and he learned the secret of focus. However, this solution didn't make him antisocial and isolated at school, where it seems his fertile brain was a source of mischief, which probably gained him attention amongst some of his peers. He was a strong-willed, self-sufficient little individual, and in early primary school, his stepmother, also confusingly called Kit, decided to send him to a nearby school of which a good friend was principal. We're not sure of the reason, but after a relatively short time, the principal requested that Kit remove him and return him whence he came. After 3 years at De La Salle Marrickville, where he surprised, or perhaps shocked, his father by singing the lead role in The Mikado, Kit again organised his move to the school of her choice, Christian Brothers Lewisham, of which Gary has spoken. So I think we have a picture of a strong-willed, intelligent, frustrating student who did well enough but never really fulfilled his academic potential. And we all know them. As Gary has also told us, this not quite 17-year-old was let loose into the wonderful world of the early 60s Sydney University. Officially, Bernie was there to obtain a BSc and become a teacher, but his cunning plan was to end up as an industrial chemist. However, the non-academic delights of university life led him astray, and once he succumbed to the lure of Bill Collins' Film Society, all his energy went into this new passion. I should also add that his parents chose this year to go on the grand tour of Europe and the British Isles. And of course in 1961 this meant long travel times by sea, so they were away for some 6 months. This left his newly married brother, Jack, and his bride as the responsible adults to keep an eye on the lad. Not an enviable task. So 1962 saw him at Sydney Teachers College, and 1964 he was posted to the Science Department of Liverpool Boys High. And in the August of that year, a friend of mine who was also at the school held a party in her newly acquired and very tiny flat. Somehow, I found myself spending a considerable part of the evening next to the refrigerator in pleasant conversation with a young man. Much later, I realised that this lengthy, relaxed and comfortable chat was of great significance because Bernie was never comfortable making polite conversation with strangers. It would seem we just clicked. It took him a week to get around to a phone call after that, and the excuse was that he was moonlighting on the Elizabethan opera season at that time. And our first date was at the opera, with me smuggled into one of the theatre boxes from which Bernie was operating a follow spot. Several more trips to the opera followed that season. Now, as you've heard, Bernie subsequently joined the Genesian Theatre, and he managed sound and lighting needs there for almost 10 years. And the theatre became our social life, and Bernie spent very little time at his family home, and, as he had learned to do, paid little attention to his parents' concern as to his whereabouts. As I was sharing a flat, and so had living expenses, we began to think it might make sense to both live in the same place, which, of course, in 1965 meant marriage. Believing that this was a good idea, we took that step almost 51 years ago on the 3rd of September 1966. I discovered that Bernie didn't have many memories of his childhood, certainly not in the detail recounted earlier, but he was certain that he wanted a different family life. I also discovered that he lacked a very important skill, that of multitasking. On his first experience of doing the washing, he went off to the shared laundry on the landing outside our flat, and he never returned. I found him in the laundry doing the washing, watching the machine as it did the job. He would attempt most domestic tasks if the need was pointed out to him, except for one. Just as he never achieved qualifications in multitasking, he steadfastly resisted any suggestion that he should learn to cook. As our family group grew, we became part of the larger shepherd flock as his older brothers and sisters encouraged him back into the fold. A wonderful element of this was the apology from his brother Jack and sister Maureen for using him as a weapon against their stepmother. So, how did I cope with finding myself living with this complex individual that I thought I knew? Over the years, I tried a variety of ways, though not always with success. Eventually, after quite a number of years, I realised that he was really an immovable object in many ways, and there was only one path to success. It was Bernie's abiding wish that I should be actively independent. And of course, you realise that this guaranteed his freedom to work in his singular way. Well, a major event in 1974 was, as well as the births of our children in the earlier years, my opportunity to go to university again, thanks to Gough Whitlam. Working as a curriculum consultant at the time, Bernie was based at Macquarie University. And by that time, we had acquired a second old car. I would drive over to the uni with our 3 young children in the late afternoon, and we would swap keys in the car park. Bernie would take the young fry home, and I would go off to enjoy the evening lectures and tutorials in a kid-free zone. The ladies in the office were very impressed by this arrangement. That is, the part where the children's father actually dealt with their baths, bedtime and their tea. Well, it was the 1970s. As long as I was prepared to make the bookings, plan an itinerary, or suggest and organise an activity or an event, Bernie would be happy to come along. And he usually enjoyed himself. In retirement, we had some wonderful trips, both within Australia and many places beyond. But it is undeniable that left to himself, he would have spent all his time working on a problem or a special project of some kind inside his own physical and mental space. He had to be lured out, and fortunately, the love of film and theatre that we had always shared was an effective lure. Although we missed a few plays in the last 12 months, we still kept going to the theatre as long as it was physically possible. He had become immersed in the past in search for his shepherd ancestry, and as was his habit, he constructed a research project par excellence, delighting in tracking down the most elusive piece of information. Unfortunately, he was so thorough in attempting to trace the first shepherd, who arrived as a guest of His Majesty in the early 1800s, and also in following a family legal case of Dickensian proportions, that he ran out of time to complete the whole story. Bernie also became a devotee of crime novels. But when he discovered that something he enjoyed was part of a series, he would then research an up-to-date list of the series and read the lot in order. He was halfway through the last book of his current series when he no longer had the energy to read. But I consider, as I think our granddaughter said, that his leading role came along in his later life as the patriarch of his own family. His pride in everyone's achievements in many and varied areas was tinged with a regret that he wouldn't be here to see what the younger grandchildren might achieve. In the last year of his life, he taught what those close to him considered to be his greatest lesson, in the way he continued to contribute to the greater good, while retaining his sense of humour and growing even closer to his family. And best of all, he remained himself to the end of his time with us. I know that Bernie would be disappointed if I didn't include at least one quotation from Shakespeare. So, having begun by quoting from The Life of Brian, I will end with these words from Macbeth. Nothing in his life became him like the leaving of it. He was a gentleman on whom I built an absolute trust. Thank you.
So that brings us nearly to the end of our time here today. On behalf of the family, I'd just like to take a moment to thank both Gary and Chris for their efforts in organising much of what we've enjoyed today, and also to St Mary's Senior High for providing this, I think, most appropriate of venues, and particularly to Fatima and her team for the production and for taking it to the wider world who perhaps were not able to join us. Secondly, I'd just like to reiterate on behalf of our family just how touched we are and how grateful by all of your thoughts and your presence here today, and also the words and actions of support that came in not only in the recent weeks but in the weeks beforehand as well. It's truly been a comfort to us and no small measure of pride to see the esteem in which Dad is held. There is only one last thing left to say, and we have one final speaker to say it. Ladies and gentlemen, the final word.
Yes, folks, it's me, at a somewhat livelier point in time. I know that custom and practice at these events says that the guest of honour should remain silent and in most cases unseen. But I thought, well, anyone who knows me well enough to be here today would probably understand that I might do things a little bit differently. So, at the risk of offending some who I hope will forgive me, I'm trusting the rest of you will allow a very limited intrusion. I'm flattered that a number of people wanted to speak today, and I don't want to presume or preempt anything they might have had in mind. I have just one point that I want to make. Please know that I appreciate your being here today, not for my part, but for the support you're providing for Meg and my family. However much these events are anticipated and planned for, they still have to be lived through. And I do deeply appreciate the solidarity that you're showing by your presence here today. If there's anyone who hasn't heard me say it, let me declare once again the enormous pride that Meg and I have felt in watching our three wonderful children, Tim, David and Emma, with their partners, grow and produce their own remarkable and unique families. For the full unexpurgated version of this, I refer you to the speech that we made at our 50th wedding anniversary last year. You can be assured that I left this life more than grateful for the huge good fortune, joy and wonderful people that filled it, starting, but no way ending, with our family. In fact, the only thing stopping me from bursting into a chorus of Je ne regrette rien, apart from my lack of a sexy French singing voice, is that I do in fact have one regret that I leave the perch with. For over 50 years, Meg has been my friend, partner, lover, colleague, travelling companion, organiser, chief critic, support staff, and many other things, most recently, nurse. We have experienced all of life's milestone events, both good and not so good, together. Meg, I'm only sorry to have to part from you now when, but for a bit of rogue DNA, we might have had many more years together. Still, I leave secure in the knowledge that our three wonderful children, many grandchildren, our host of good friends, will do everything they can to ensure your happiness and welfare now and into a long and active future. I know they will, because they know I'll come back and haunt them if they ever go slack on it. Well, that's all from me. I'll get out of your way now so that you can get through the formalities and enjoy the party.